Well, welcome to this video, and I hope you like it. If you do, click the like button, hit subscribe, and share with a friend. Okay, this one's a little bit of a little more of an off the top of my head rant here, but just wanted to talk a little bit about probability and certainty. Unfortunately, we tend to live in a world where people want concrete answers. They want everything to be black and white. And it's not always like that. Especially in my background as an engineer. It's not, are you sure? It's how sure are you? That's the big question. Because no matter how much you know, there's always more that you don't know. You have to come to the best conclusion you can based on the information at hand. But people often misinterpret science, including scientists themselves, as, being very absolute. Some individual facts, maybe to some extent, but there's always some doubt there. People are more comforted by concrete answers, obviously, but we can't always have them. Evolution is a very good example of that, not from the point of view of does evolution exist or not, but just our history that we have as far as fossils and, gaps in the record and everything. To look at it from an engineering point of view, I'll give you a little bit of a background on a project I was actually a part of. They were building a tank, or they were supposed to build a tank, and the engineering firm that did the design went out there and did soil borings. Well, they did the soil borings before they had the final location nailed down for the tank. It was on it was done in a rush for various reasons. But they didn't have they didn't do all the testing necessarily where they should have, but they did have a couple of borings sort of next to where the tank ended up, and based on these borings, they looked and they said, well, the soil is going to be this fill. It's what they call alluvial soil. It's basically like river gravel and sand all mixed together. Alluvium is basically the stuff that washes up and makes the banks and kind of shifts around in flowing water. So basically this was on the banks of the Allegheny River, and the place was mostly backfilled to build up the land in this low area along the river with material that was dredged from the river itself after the lock and dam system went through. So that's what they expected to find. That's what their borings that they did take showed pretty much everywhere on the site. This was all backfilled. And they also knew that, at some point in time, there was a spur coming off the railroad track to load chemicals to this building, but the track was long since abandoned and removed. But at any rate, whenever they actually went to build the tank, not only did they find out that that railroad existed before that particular area was backfilled and the train tracks were actually on a trestle that had a buried foundation under all that, they also found out that at least in that area, much of the backfill was what they call granulated slag. Some people call it blue dog slag. It's this ground up byproduct of steel making that basically it fuses back together like concrete. You have to chip at it with a sledgehammer or a jackhammer. You can't just dig through it with an excavator, let alone just by hand with a shovel. So this was a huge surprise, and it encompassed almost the entire area of the actual tank. Their borings just happened to miss it. Now normally, you do a little bit of research. You look and see, well, what do soils maps and that tell me is there? And it gives you kind of an idea what to expect. But to actually design something, you should go out there and do test borings. You drill a hole and you see what's down there at different levels, what kind of material, and you take a record of that. And normally, if you have a number of holes, you can kind of average between them. If bedrock in your deepest hole is at, say, 20 feet, and bedrock in your shallowest hole is at 16 feet, well, then you can kind of say that you're going to hit bedrock somewhere between 16 and 20 feet along a line drawn between those two holes. That's a fair assumption usually. And if everything's kind of similar, you feel more confident in that. Now, if things are way off, if you drill down 20 feet in one spot and hit sandstone, and you drill down 16 feet in another spot and you hit limestone or granite or some different type of rock, well, that's reason to think, hey, this isn't homogeneous. Maybe something's going on in between here. You're going to hit different things. Maybe we should take more borings in between to kind of figure out what it is. Whereas if in both spots you hit sandstone, you feel a lot more comfortable about that. There's a lot of other little variables in there. Personally, something being fill, I'm a little less confident between borings because fill can include anything, and you end up with situations like the example. But you never know what man-made causes, you never know what natural causes may have done in between these little snapshots you see of what's going on down there. The only way to really know is to excavate the whole area of the tank. That's the only time you're going to actually see all that. It's just cost prohibitive to excavate the entire foundation of a tank before you build the tank just to do the design. So, it just kind of shows you know what you know what's in that particular boring spot, and based on how the borings kind of play out and how many borings you have, that gives you a certain level of confidence on what you're going to find when you dig in that area. And to some extent, fossils are the same way, because I hear a lot of people arguing stupid things like, we'll use Bigfoot as an example, because it's something that's in pop culture that everybody kind of knows a little bit about. Personally, I believe that Bigfoot must have existed at one point in time, simply based on the fact that the people that lived in the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years claimed that this was a real creature that lived there. Does that mean it still exists today? No, have no clue. But, I think these people, maintain this knowledge of what lived in their area. Could have died off for a number of reasons before anybody got out there to look for it. May still exist, just don't know. But the argument you always hear is like, well, if it really existed, we'd find bones and there'd be fossils and this and that. Fossils only happen under ideal conditions. Basically, to prevent a body from being totally basically dissolved into nothing over time, it has to be buried and protected. And that only happens under, certain conditions. It has to be buried and left undisturbed. Now, like along a river here, in Appalachia, you're not going to form fossils. The water moves too fast. It'll bury something that dies in a creek. But, every time there's a rain, that creek floods a little bit, all that gravel shifting around is just going to grind them bones up into nothing. Most of your fossils are found in things like, lake beds and swamps where things sank in the mud, or, maybe something got buried in a landslide or something, a more or less one-time event that buries something and leaves it permanently buried until it becomes fossilized. And you've got to look around that, just the world around you. I mean, there's deer everywhere in Pennsylvania. Every year, all the male deer grow antlers. Some of them grow little spikes, some of them grow a huge rack. But every year they grow antlers. And every year they shed those antlers and they grow a new set the next year. Over thousands of years, deer have been doing this in this state. If things normally turn into fossils, you wouldn't be able to dig a hole and plant a tomato plant because you'd be running into antlers every time you stuck a shovel in the soil. The reality is that when something dies, it gets torn apart by, predators and scavengers and whatever else. It gets damaged by, wind and weather. And even though the bones last the longest, mice and rodents and that'll start gnawing on the bones. That's what happens to a lot of the antlers. If you find them, around March, you can find some nice antlers that are dropped. If you find them even later in the spring, they're half gnawed up by rodents. And that's what normally happens to everything that dies. Their bones get destroyed. That's normal. That's why we have things like the coelacanth, a so-called living fossil. They don't have any fossils after about the time of the dinosaurs, and then all of a sudden, hey, it still lives today. And they live down around South Africa and Madagascar, and I think there's another species over by Indonesia, I think they found too. But at any rate, it's like these things have continued to live for millions of years without leaving any fossils. It happens. There's a lot of things that we don't have fossils of. A lot of the fossils we do find, because of, like I said, it has to be something that's preserved and undisturbed, and that a lot of times things get disturbed and you only find a piece of it. They find a jawbone, they find a foot. It's kind of rare to find a complete skeleton. These are the rarities. These are the exceptions. And of course, it helps when you're something big like a dinosaur that has, big bones that kind of resist the shifting soils and things like that a little bit more. Just in general, big objects tend to stay together more than little objects. Although, there's a huge number of smaller animals compared to the larger animals, and they can also find a more protected little area, so there's some offsetting things there, but just in general, you have to understand that. And that's part of the reason when you're looking at, evolution and how did we get from point A to point B with a particular plant or animal, and you're trying to trace out its history, you've got all these huge gaps. I mean, they're always finding new things, but at the same time, it's not like there's any guarantee that if something existed, it ever produced a fossil at all. In fact, the odds are actually against it. Only things that, lived in the right circumstances, became fossils. Something that lived on, dry ridge tops probably didn't get, stuck in the mud somewhere and become a fossil, unless they just happen to be in the right kind of a landslide or something. Probably never happened. And even if it did happen in one or two isolated events, somebody's got to find it. Somebody's got to stumble across it. And somebody's got to stumble across it without just blowing it apart, dynamiting part of a hillside to make a road or something. It's a lot rarer of a happening than a lot of people like to make out. So, just a little bit of food for thought, and leave it there, and I'll see you on the next one. Well, I hope you found that video informative. Hopefully it made you think, and please click the like button and subscribe if you haven't done that already, and check out the video that should be appearing somewhere around me here, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.